Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today, we are cracking open a time capsule from 2,000 years ago that somehow predicts exactly how we should manage modern burnout, leadership, and, our connection to the universe.
It's really incredible when you get into it.
We're looking at the Huainanzi, which is this massive Chinese encyclopedia of wisdom that argues the best way to do everything is to do nothing.
Well, not exactly nothing.
Not exactly. Buckle up, because we're exploring the art of ruling the world by letting it rule itself.
It's a fascinating contradiction, isn't it? We're diving into a text from the Han Dynasty, specifically around 139 BCE.
A long time ago.
A very long time ago. And usually when you think of ancient texts, you expect, rigid rules or mystical poetry. But
Yeah.
this is a survival guide for an emperor that reads like a modern manual on systems thinking.
Yeah, let's set the scene a little bit before we get too deep into the philosophy itself. This wasn't written by just one guy sitting in a cave meditating.
Oh, not at all. This was a massive government project.
Right.
It was commissioned by Liu An, who's the king of Huai Nan.
Mhm.
And he wasn't just a ruler. He was a huge patron of arts and philosophy.
So we brought in the experts.
He gathered a court of scholars, some historical accounts say thousands of them, to compile what was essentially a universal encyclopedia.
Wow.
Yeah, the mission was incredibly ambitious. They wanted to synthesize everything known at the time, astronomy, geography, politics, metaphysics, you name it, into one single coherent system.
It's basically the Wikipedia of 139 BCE.
Exactly, but with a very specific editorial slant. And that slant is based entirely on the Tao.
The way.
Correct. They were trying to build a theory of everything for the emperor.
Yeah.
The idea was if the emperor understood the fundamental pattern of the universe, the Tao, he could rule the entire empire without exhausting himself.
Okay, that brings us to the big question, and really the mission of this deep dive today. When I first looked at the prep notes, my first thought was, okay, cool history lesson, but how can a book written for an ancient king help someone today?
Right.
Someone who is just stressed out, overworking, maybe trying to manage a team.
It is the ultimate question.
Yeah.
And the answer, I think, lies in how the Huainanzi tackles this fundamental tension between human effort and the natural order of things.
Okay.
It's constantly asking us, are we forcing things to happen or are we allowing them to unfold? It suggests that most of our stress, our failures, our exhaustion, whether you're an emperor or a middle manager, it all comes from trying to swim upstream against the structure of the universe.
So let's talk about that structure. And I want to get into something specific here because the text dives into cosmology almost immediately. It starts with the Way, or the Tao.
Yes, the very first volume, Original Tao.
It describes the Tao as something that covers the heavens and supports the earth. It extends to the 4 directions and 8 poles. It's high beyond reach, deep beyond measure. Now, when I'm reading a description of something that is invisible, all-powerful, and the source of everything, it sounds a lot like we're talking about God. Is the Tao God?
That is the crucial distinction to make, and it's where this text gets really interesting when you think about ideas of theism or the nature of divinity itself. Well, the short answer is no. Not in the way a Western monotheistic tradition would define God anyway.
How so? What's the key difference?
Well, the Huainanzi is extremely careful to define the Tao as formless. The ancestor of all things, sure, but it isn't a personality.
So it doesn't have a will.
Exactly. It doesn't have a beard. It doesn't sit on a throne. It doesn't judge you. It's the operating system of reality.
The operating system? That's a great analogy. I like that.
Think of it this way. Before there were any gods, there was the Tao. The text explicitly lays out the cosmology. It says that before heaven and earth even existed, there was just this formless, misty chaos. It calls this the Great Beginning.
And out of this chaos, the text mentions 2 gods.
Yes, it says 2 gods were born to organize the sky and earth. These are forces that represent the separation of yin and yang. But notice the hierarchy there.
They're a product of the Tao.
They're products of the Tao. They're organizers, born from the chaos. They aren't the ultimate source. The ultimate source is the formless, the Tao itself.
So in this worldview, the divine isn't a creator who stands outside the universe making things.
No.
The divine is the process of the universe itself unfolding.
Precisely. The text even breaks down our own existence this way. It says that spirit belongs to heaven and the skeleton, our physical body, belongs to earth.
Okay.
So when we die, the spirit goes back to the gate of heaven and our bones go back to the root of earth. It's a recycling process.
It's very systematic.
It is. You could almost call it an atheistic system in the modern sense because there's no judge or king in the sky.
Huh.
But at the same time, it's deeply spiritual because everything is imbued with this spirit or energy.
It's just strictly cause and effect, but on a cosmic scale.
And this formless nature is exactly why the Tao is so powerful. The text is obsessed with the water metaphor. It says the Tao is swirling and vast.
Water flows and does not stop.
Right. And just think about water for a second. It has no shape of its own. It takes the shape of whatever container holds it.
Put it in a cup, it's a cup. You put it in a bottle, it's a bottle.
Exactly. It yields. It's soft.
But the text also says this paradoxical thing. Weak, but capable of being strong, soft, but capable of being hard.
That is the core paradox.
Mm-hmm.
We usually think of strength as rigidity. A rock is strong. A steel wall is strong. But the Huainanzi argues that rigidity is actually brittleness.
It can break?
It shatters. If you hit a rock hard enough, it shatters. But you can't shatter water. You can strike water with a sword, and what happens?
It just flows around the blade.
It flows around the blade and reforms instantly. It's undefeated because it never fights back directly.
So the argument is that the Tao, and by extension, the person who follows the Tao, is invincible not because they're hard, but because they're fluid.
Exactly. And this leads directly to the text's big critique of how we modern humans, and remember, modern for them was 2,000 years ago, try to navigate the world.
Yeah.
There's this wild allegory in Volume 1 about two ancient chariot drivers, Feng Yi and Da Bing.
This part was amazing. It read like a fantasy novel. It says they rode chariots of clouds into the rainbow.
Treading on frost and snow without leaving tracks. It's just beautiful imagery.
It really is. It sounds like they're magicians or something. But the text is using them to make a very practical point, right?
A very practical point. It's comparing them to the drivers of the Han Dynasty. The text describes these contemporary drivers.
And what do they look like?
They're using whips. They're using these elaborate gold bits in the horses' mouths. They're yanking on the reins. They're shouting. They're sweating. They're calculating every single turn.
You're trying really hard.
They're trying so hard. And yet what happens? They crash, they struggle, they exhaust themselves and their horses.
Because they're fighting the horses?
They're fighting the horses, they're fighting the road, they're fighting the wind. But Feng Yi and Da Bing, the ancient ones,
they weren't fighting.
They moved with the universe. They didn't need to force the chariot because they were aligned with the nature of the clouds and the wind. The lesson is that the ancients achieved these incredible things by doing very little, while we modern people struggle against the world with our tools and our force and our anxiety. And we get nowhere.
That transitions perfectly into the concept everyone has probably heard of, but maybe misunderstands, Wu Wei.
Wu Wei.
It translates to non-action. And I have to play devil's advocate here. If the universe runs itself and the best drivers don't even use reins, does the Huainanzi just want to sit on the couch? Is this a philosophy of laziness?
It is absolutely not a philosophy of laziness. In fact, the text is very defensive about this point.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in Volume 19, which is titled Cultivating Effort, it specifically brings up the example of Shenong, the divine farmer.
Shenong is a legend, right? The father of agriculture.
Yes, the mythological inventor of agriculture and medicine. The text tells us that Shenong tasted hundreds of herbs to find medicines for the people. Legend says he was poisoned 70 times in a single day.
Okay, wait. Getting poisoned 70 times a day does not sound like non-action.
Not at all.
That sounds like the hardest day at work imaginable.
It was immense effort. But the text argues this was Wu Wei, because Wu Wei doesn't mean inaction in the sense of physically doing nothing. It means no unnatural action.
No unnatural action.
It means acting in accordance with the grain of reality. Shenong wasn't fighting nature, he was investigating it. He was submitting himself to the nature of the plants to understand how they actually worked.
So non-action really means no forced action.
Frictionless action might be the best way to think about it. The text uses a great analogy about fishing.
Oh, I like this one. Lay it out for us.
It says, if you want to catch fish, you have two choices. Choice A, you jump into the river, you splash around, you try to chase the fish and grab them with your bare hands.
Which is chaos. You're just scaring all the fish away, you're freezing cold, and you probably won't catch anything.
That is action. That is imposing your will on the river. That is using force.
Okay, so what's choice B?
Choice B, you sit by the river, you study it, you see where the current flows, you dig a little channel or you place a net where the fish naturally want to go, and then you wait.
And the river brings the fish to you?
The river brings the fish to you. That is Wu Wei. You achieve the exact same goal catching the fish, but you do it by leveraging the power of the river rather than fighting against it.
The text also compares this to a swimmer versus a drowning person. I found that really powerful.
It's a stark image. Think about the physics of that. A swimmer and a drowning person are in the exact same water. The water is deep, it's heavy, it's potentially dangerous.
Right.
The drowning person treats the water as an enemy. They thrash, they panic, they try to climb out of the water, which is impossible. And all that fighting just exhausts them, and they sink.
But the swimmer?
The swimmer treats the water as a vehicle. They relax into it. They use the natural buoyancy of their body. They move with the current, not against it. The water supports them.
The only difference is their relationship to the water.
The only difference between living and dying in that river is your relationship to the medium you're in.
That is such a potent image for the workplace. I mean, how many of us on a daily basis are thrashing?
Most of us. We're trying to force outcomes. We're trying to impose our will. The text has another great line. Fire burns wood, but if you try to use fire to melt metal, it requires a different method.
You can't just turn up the heat.
You can't force fire to act on metal the way it acts on wood just because you want it to. You have to understand the nature of metal first. If you violate the nature of the thing you're working with, you fail.
And the consequence of that failure isn't just that the project fails, it's that you fail. You burn out.
Literally. The text says, and this is a direct quote, "Those who rely on the Tao are at ease and not exhausted. Those who rely on calculation are toiling and have no merit."
Rely on calculation. Oof, that one hits home. We are obsessed with calculating everything, optimizing every minute, every metric.
And the Huainanzi warns that if you are constantly calculating, constantly trying to outsmart the system, you are disconnecting yourself from the source of energy. You are running on your own little battery pack instead of being plugged into the main grid.
This feels like it has massive implications for leadership. I mean, the book was written for a king, after all. It's a manual on how to be the boss.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
And the advice it gives is, well, it's pretty counterintuitive to how we usually picture a strong leader or a CEO today.
Yeah, usually we think of the leader as the smartest person in the room, the visionary, the one barking orders and pointing the way forward.
The Huainanzi argues that is a recipe for disaster, a total disaster.
Why?
It says a ruler shouldn't even try to be smarter or stronger than everyone else. It says if a ruler relies only on their own eyes, they can't see everything. If they rely on the eyes of the whole kingdom, nothing is hidden.
So it's about distributed intelligence. It's about a leader admitting, I can't possibly know everything.
It's about utilization. There's a great section in Volume 9, The Art of Rulership, that talks about using things and people for their specific nature.
Right.
It gives this very rustic, very clear example. You don't ask a cow to catch mice, and you don't ask a cat to pull a plow.
Which seems completely obvious when you say it like that. On a farm, that's just common sense. But in a corporate office...
In an office, we do this all the time. We ask the creative visionary to do the detailed compliance paperwork. We ask the introverted data analyst to lead the high-energy sales rally.
And then we get mad when they fail. Or when they're miserable.
Exactly. If you ask the cat to pull the plow, the cat fails, the plow doesn't move, and you get frustrated. But whose fault is that?
It's the farmer's fault.
Right.
The leader's fault.
It is the leader's fault for not recognizing the nature of the cat. The text says a good leader simply places people where their nature fits. If you force a person to do something against their nature, it's like trying to make a square peg fit a round hole. You break the peg and you damage the hole.
So the leader's most important job isn't to do the work, but to understand the nature of the workers.
Yes. And to be able to do that, the leader needs to be calm. This brings us to another key concept, the mirror mindset.
The text talks about the ruler's mind being like a mirror or like still water. I found this really profound.
It's in a few places, especially Volume 2 and Volume 12. Think about a pool of water. If the water is agitated, if it's splashing around, can it reflect your face clearly?
No, it's just a blur. You can't see anything.
Right. The Huainanzi argues that if a leader is emotional, if they are excessively angry or even overly happy and excited, their mind is like that agitated water. They cannot reflect the truth of the situation. They can't see things as they actually are.
So the leader has to be the calmest person in the room?
The leader must be yin, which is quiet, receptive, still, so they can accurately perceive the yang, which is the active moving world around them. If the leader is too yang, too active and loud and emotional, they just clash with the world instead of understanding it.
If you're screaming, you can't hear what your team is trying to tell you.
It's that simple.
Yeah.
And that connects back to the biology of it, too. We have this learner profile who is interested in how this affects us physically, psychologically.
Yeah.
The Huainanzi isn't just philosophy, it's almost like a medical text in some parts. It treats our mental energy, our spirit, as a finite resource.
A literal substance.
It treats spirit, or Shen, as a very literal substance. In Volume 7, Seminal Breath and Spirit, it warns that your spirit can be leaked or drained by your desires and your senses.
I found this part so incredibly relatable to the modern world. It says, 5 colors confuse the eye, 5 sounds deafen the ear.
It's a critique of sensory overload, and you have to remember for them, 5 colors and 5 sounds represented the entirety of sensory experience in their way of categorizing things.
Today, it's 1,000,000 colors and 1,000,000,000 sounds. It's the notification ping on your phone every 5 seconds. It's the 24-hour news cycle. It's endless scrolling.
Precisely. The idea in the text is that when we are constantly bombarded by sights, sounds, entertainment, and flashing lights, we aren't just getting distracted. We are biologically damaging our essence. We are shaking the water in our minds so the sediment never, ever settles.
So 2,000 years ago, they were already worried about doom scrolling.
In a way, yes. They believe that if your senses are constantly chasing things outside yourself, chasing the 5 colors, as they put it, your spirit leaves its house.
Its house being the body.
Yes. And when the spirit is gone, the body just falls apart. It becomes an empty shell.
Okay, so talking about the body falling apart and some really weird transformations, we have to talk about the tiger story.
Yes. Gun Huai. You cannot read the Huainanzi without stopping at this story.
This story completely threw me for a loop. I had to read it twice. So there's a man named Gan Ai. He gets sick, and after 7 days, he turns into a tiger.
Yes, a literal tiger. Claws, stripes, the whole thing.
And his brother, being a good brother, goes to check on him. He walks into the house, and the tiger, who used to be Gan Ai, jumps out and kills the brother.
It is a dark, brutal story.
Why is this in a book about leadership and Taoist philosophy? What is the lesson here? Don't visit your sick brother.
The lesson is about the fluidity of form. The Huainanzi is trying to shock you into challenging your attachment to being human.
Challenging our attachment to being human, that's a pretty big ask.
It is, but look at it from the perspective of the Tao. Remember, the Tao is the formless ancestor of all things. The text argues that the form changed. Gan Huai went from a human shape to a tiger shape. But the life, the underlying biological energy, continued.
So to the Tao, it's all the same stuff, just in a different package?
Exactly. To the Tao, being a human or being a tiger are just different temporary shapes, different configurations of energy.
So it's saying, don't take your own humanity so seriously.
It's saying we shouldn't be so attached to our current form or so terrified of death. It uses another less shocking metaphor. Death is like ice melting into water. The ice is gone, the shape is lost, but the water itself remains. The tiger story is just a shocking way to force you to realize that you are just a temporary arrangement of energy.
That is both comforting and also kind of terrifying.
That is the Tao. It's indifferent. It doesn't care if you are a man or a tiger. It just cares that the energy flows and transforms. It reminds us that change is the only constant. If you fight that change, if you insist on remaining ice when the season for water has come, you suffer.
This also connects to what the text says about how the environment shapes us. It's not just an internal thing. It talks about orange trees.
Right, that's in Volume 4, a great simple example. It notes that if you take an orange tree that grows south of the river, where it produces sweet, delicious fruit, and you transplant it north of the river, it turns into a thorny bush. It produces bitter, inedible fruit.
The tree didn't decide to become bad. The tree didn't become lazy or lose its motivation.
No. The environment changed its nature.
The soil was different, the water was different, the air was different.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This reinforces the idea that we are all products of our breath or energy interacting with our location.
Yeah.
If you are a leader or just a person trying to thrive, you have to look at your soil. Are you an orange tree trying to grow in a thorny bush environment?
I think a lot of people feel like that thorny bush at work. They feel sharp and bitter and unproductive.
And if so, the text implies that no amount of willpower or hustle is going to make you sweet. You need to move back south of the river. You need to find the environment that matches your fundamental nature.
That's a huge takeaway for the workplace. If you're failing, maybe you're not lazy. Maybe you're just a tropical plant stuck in the Arctic.
And that kind of understanding leads to a broader tolerance, which is another really surprising feature of this text. It has a very relativistic, very modern view of truth and custom.
Yeah, Volume 11, Equalizing Customs. It basically says just because they do it differently doesn't mean they're wrong, which for that time period is pretty radical.
Very radical. It uses the example of funeral rites. It looks at different cultures that were known to the Han Chinese at the time. Some cultures bury their dead. Some use fire and cremate them. Some put them in rivers.
And normally the impulse is to look at other cultures and say, wow, those people are barbarians. They're doing it wrong.
Correct. But the text argues that the real, which is the feeling of grief, the love for the parent, is the same in all of them. But the artifice, the specific ritual you perform, differs from place to place.
So the core emotion is universal, but the expression of it is local.
Yes. It distinguishes between the core feeling and the cultural wrapper. It wants us not to judge the wrapper as immoral or wrong just because it isn't what we do.
This was a direct shot at the debaters of the time, right? The people who were constantly arguing over definitions.
It was a very pointed critique of sophistry. The Huainanzi attacks the debaters, and this was likely aimed at certain factions of Confucians and Mohists who were obsessed with defining righteousness and benevolence with ever more complicated and strict rules.
The text says they are looking at the branches and completely missing the root.
He uses a fantastic analogy for this. It says it's like trying to put out a fire while holding kindling.
Explain that one.
If you try to fix society by adding more and more rules, more laws, more definitions of what's right and wrong, you are just adding more fuel to the fire. You're creating more criminals by creating more laws for them to break. You are making things more complicated when the real solution is actually simplicity.
Because you're moving further and further away from the natural order, you're trying to engineer goodness instead of just letting goodness grow naturally from the root.
Precisely. The Huainanzi advocates for stripping away all those artificial layers and returning to what it calls the uncarved block, that state of pure potential, before we started labeling everything and arguing about the labels.
So bringing this all back together, we've got this incredible book that says, don't force things, use the eyes of others, don't hold on to your shape too tightly, and stop judging other people's ritual.
At its core, it all comes down to power through alignment. The Huainanzi tells us that true power, whether you're ruling an empire or just ruling your own nervous system, comes from aligning with the way things are, not from forcing them to be the way you want. The goal is to conserve our spirit, that precious mental energy, and move with the day.
It's a call to stop fighting the current, to recognize that we are part of this massive transformative system, and all our frantic attempts to control it usually just end up making things messy.
And if I can offer a final thought for you to mull over.
And a provocative thought.
The text says, those who possess the day are weak in ambition but strong in affairs.
Weak in ambition but strong in affairs. Wow. That is the opposite of every LinkedIn bio I've ever seen in my life.
Think about that for a second. We live in a world that screams at you to be ambitious, to be aggressive, to be loud if you want to succeed, lean in, hustle.
Right.
But the Huainanzi suggests this incredible paradox. What if the person who actually gets the most done is the one who seemingly cares the least?
The one who isn't gripping the steering wheel so hard their knuckles turn white.
Exactly. So here's the final thought for you to chew on. What if trying hard is actually the biggest obstacle to doing well? What if the best thing you could do for your career, for your life, was to just let go and ride the cloud?
A lot to think about. Thanks for listening to this deep dive. Keep thinking deeper.